Welcome to St Paul's Cathedral tonight, the cathedral in the heart of the city of Melbourne. I'm Ray Cleary, I'm the Acting Dean of the Cathedral for the present. In welcoming you here this evening, I wish first of all to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the people of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to their elders, to their children, and for their hopes for the future. This cathedral church plays a special role in the life of this city and wider community. It is a major place for civic events, for concerts and the arts, and it attracts thousands of visitors, worshippers and sojourners each year. The cathedral stands in the fine tradition of Anglican worship and attracts preachers and speakers of the highest standard. It stands as the gateway to the city alongside Federation Square, Young and Jackson's and Flinders Street Station. Each of these four landmarks contribute to the thought and life of this city. The church has always been a voice in the community of Melbourne, as it is tonight in welcoming two distinguished speakers on the subject of the role of reason in faith and unbelief. Those speakers, I'm sure, will come to this subject matter with a great deal of detail and thought, and I suspect from different positions, and will, I'm sure, provide all of us with much food for thought as we leave this cathedral. Each of our speakers will speak for 15 minutes, and then they will be given 5 minutes to respond to each other and to add any further comment. Following the presentation, there will be time for questions. However, given the fact that there are probably 700 or 800 people here tonight, I will need to use my discretion and use the chairman's prerogative. My task is to monitor tonight, and we have three people over here on my right, Tim, John and Stephen, who are going to receive your SMS text messages. And they will then pass the questions on to me, which are to be succinct and short and directed towards the presentations. Succinct, short and directed to the presentations. So that will give you some clear guidelines on the questions. Let me begin by introducing our two speakers for tonight. Our first speaker this evening is the Reverend Dr. Brendan Purcell. He is adjunct professor in philosophy at Notre Dame University and an associate priest at St Mary's Cathedral, Sydney. Until recently, he was the senior lecturer in philosophy at University College of Dublin. Will you please welcome Brendan?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Bishop Barbara Darling and Canon Cleary, and also the Dean Cleary, and also Canon Stephen Ames, who very kindly took the risk of asking a mad Irishman to share this evening with you. So the topic is called the role of reason in faith and unbelief. So I think I'll start first of all by talking about two kinds of reason. And one, I think, will be a seriously impoverished kind on its own, and then I'll call that instrumental reason. And if you like, that's the kind of reason we use in technology. And while my own life and continued health in recent years is due to advances in medicine, there are relentless pressures to bend every aspect of nature and life to the demands of technological mastery. Nothing is sacrosanct. Nothing is immune to exploitation as long as it can be put to service. But this technology, which treats everything or can treat everything as a means and nothing as an end, can't provide its own purpose. It's a kind of instrumental rationality which undermines all final goals, certainly when it's let loose, refusing to acknowledge anything as an end in itself. Everything is drawn into its imperious grasp, and nothing is allowed to stand in judgment over it. I remember BBC years ago when they were discussing some, to me, horrendous technique, and there was a scientist speaking and says, but if ethics comes into this, where can we go? What can we do? And that sort of awareness, or the non-desire to have ethics in there. We're left, I think, we can be left with the technique of control that can direct everything except itself. But this project of technological mastery can, I would suggest, only remain rational if it's subordinate to a non-instrumental finality beyond itself. And of course, we ourselves can't submit to that same instrumentality. Otherwise, the instrumentality has in fact no purpose. But as C.S. Lewis noted a long time ago in The Abolition of Man, we seem to have struck a Faustian bargain, which is to sell our souls for more immediate power. So I'll just move on. That's one form of rationality which I really don't think is adequate without a deeper kind of reason. The second kind of reason, I'm not even trying to define it, I'll speak of it as reason that's open to transcendence. And from the classical Greeks right through to Dante uses a word transhumanar, which is to transhumanize, right up to Emmanuel Levinas, a French philosopher's, French-Lithuanian philosopher's understanding that each human being is in debt, is a hostage to the other. It's been understood that to be human, we have to be more than human. If we're only human, we're in danger of being dehumanized. So let's have a look. The word reason developed in a tradition from around 500 BC in Greece with three people you could call mystic, not meaning obscure, but mystic philosophers. So they would be Xenophanes, you may not have heard of, Parmenides and Heraclitus. And each of them named the horizon of reason. They gave it different names because they were actively questioning. They weren't repeating. So Xenophanes' name for the horizon of reason was the one. Parmenides' name for the horizon of reason was is, you could say with an exclamation mark, existence as such. And Heraclitus' name for the same horizon was logos, or word, or meaning. So that's more or less, they defined reason correlatively with what it reached out to. A couple of generations later, Plato and Aristotle got in on that within that tradition, but developed it. And just to take Aristotle's, where he got to it around, say, 350 BC, he spoke of a first cause, a first ground of reality. But he's another beautiful name for what's at the end of reason. If he says all human beings are in search of the ground of existence, and the name that he gives for it is the understanding of understanding. That was his word for what we might call God. And that's carried on right up to our own time. You have a whole, if you like, gamut of philosophers: Kant, Hegel, Schelling, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Levinas, Derrida. That's 8 of them on one go. All of them in their own way, returning to and deepening that quest. They're very different people, and yet you can find in all of them that. And to an extent, I find the public atheists of our time, at least the English language ones, seem to completely neglect it. I'm not debating Richard Dawkins here, but in a long book, over 400 pages, The God Delusion, he never once refers to the one tradition that's explored this issue of transcendence that is profoundly non-religious. It's based on reason. That's why I want to stick to that one. So let's say, let's pick 2 aspects out of this, what we can call radical questioning, which I think was discovered by the Greeks from, as I say, 500 BC on. And so 2 aspects would be, one, we'll use a much later word than theirs, ontological, which will deal with existence as such. And then there'll be the obvious other one, which will be the moral issue. I'll only spend a second on that first kind. We could easily spend a whole debate on it or discussion. We're never going to end up agreeing. But let's say this first kind of radical questioning as ontological. And that has to do with the question you've often heard it raised, you may have raised it yourself. How is there something rather than nothing? Which is simply a way of putting the mystery of existence right before us. As Wittgenstein put it himself, it's not how things are in the world that's mysterious, but that it exists. And that's the question that's referred to by that. A philosopher of science called Ernest Macmillan puts it like this. My argument, he says, has nothing to do with saying, look, there's something science can't explain, which we can explain with God. That's not it. This is Macmillan. What's being postulated here is a reason why there should be anything at all for physics to study in the first place. which is a question raised by a new book by a man called Krauss, who doesn't really deal with that issue. But I really want to get on to what I think is much more interesting for Professor Singer. He said we can call each other by first names, so I'll call him Peter right through. So Peter's main problem, as far as I can work out, and if I'm doing it injustice, he will point that out very quickly, with the existence of God is at a moral level. So that will be a second kind of radical questioning. So a couple of years ago he wrote this: if God is all-knowing, he knows how much suffering there is. If he's all-powerful, he could have created a world without so much of it. And he would have done so if he were all good. If we insist on believing in divine creation, we're forced to admit that the God who made the Word cannot be all-powerful and all good. He must be either evil or a bungler. So, without denying the enormity of what suffering is or its harsh nature, I will still say what comes over to me from Peter's writings, the ones I've read, is that for him, suffering is, although he doesn't like the word absolute, is the absolute evil, to be abolished, it seems to me, at all costs. But why is pain and suffering absolutely or almost absolutely wrong? Because if some things are absolutely wrong, and I admit I'm putting in that word there must be a standard of what's absolutely right. And because simply presuming that suffering is evil and that therefore a God who would allow it can't be good, as it were, seems to skip out on a big issue here, that maybe suffering isn't in itself an absolute evil. The only way I can even begin, need I say, in 15 minutes, I am not going to resolve all these issues, but I can leave them as questions for you. So let's have a look at the different kinds of sufferings to see, are they incompatible with the notion of an intelligent and a good God? So be patient as I spell them out as far as I can. First of all, let's take natural disasters, because these are mentioned by Peter in various writings, certainly the article I've got the most help from. So natural disasters as a cause of human suffering, therefore no God. But the more we understand about our many-layered cosmos, the more we grasp the interdependence between all the levels: astrophysical, chemical, biological, botanical, zoological, and human. So there's 6 different levels of existence. And all the later levels materially depend for existence on the earlier ones. You know better than me, without the burning out of stars, there wouldn't be any of the heavy elements that we need for life, like carbon. There wouldn't be the rocky planets like the one we're living on. They would have to be just gassy planets, like Neptune, Uranus, and Saturn, and so on. So, and then take another example. Without the billion years of algae, several billion years of algae transforming the atmosphere, nothing beyond bacteria and various protists can live on Earth. So just as we can't understand the physical world we're in without gravity, the fact is then the Earth's surface, as far as we know, depends or requires the tectonic plates that it's structured in. We've just had a huge big earthquake, as you know, just in the last day or so. But we can't, that's an inbuilt law of the astrophysical universe. Obviously, many people die because of gravity. When planes crash, people fall out of windows. But it seems to me we can't really expect that the universe would be safely built so that the law of gravity wouldn't hold. I just think so, and the same will go for things like tsunamis, volcanoes, and everything else. So I think we have to accept that these laws are inbuilt into the astrophysical universe, and we better just learn to live with them, and we're getting better at it, things like tsunami warnings and so on. What about animal suffering? And I would certainly admit that's a more difficult issue. First place I normally visit when I visit new towns is the zoo. I love animals. I love watching them in different ways. I'm not saying zoos are the best place to keep them in. But let's have a look at that again. If anyone has seen a film called The March of the Penguins, wonderful film about emperor penguins in Alaska or in Antarctica, made by a French team in winter. I mean, they deserve Nobel Prizes for their courage. No one's ever made such a film in such cold weather. But emperor penguins, unlike all the other ones, breed in wintertime. I've forgotten that I do all my calculation in miles. I'm an old school person, but they go in about maybe 20 kilometres to lay the eggs, and then the mother penguin, or empress, goes out, gets some food for herself and then brings the rest back in her mouth, feeds her husband, and when the chick is opened, the egg feeds the chick, and the husband takes a long trip as well. They do that because if they had their eggs or their little kids near the coastline, they'd be swallowed up. They can't fly. A poignant moment in the film is when a skua comes in, looks very menacing, kind of vampire-like, but it's just a skua, comes in and takes one of the chicks right before your eyes and right before their parents' eyes. And the penguins do nothing. Beckett has a stage direction about people looking at one another, raising their hands and letting them fall with the gesture of hopeless compassion. I think that's out of one of one of the plays anyway. But the point would be that they don't do anything. Why? Because they can't fly. Nor should we either, because the skua has its own problem of survival. The skua, if you want them to live as well, needs to eat up what it can find. If you want polar bears, you have to have a scenario where they can eat salmon and seal up in Alaska. So in other words, if you want a new kind of world in which the higher animals or the stronger or the carnivorous ones don't effectively need to feed on lower ones in the food chain, then you better move back to bacteria. Animals are living things without any teeth. And again, it seems to me we just have to simply accept that that is built into the world. Now, for example, there's a wonderful woman called Temple Grandin in the US. She's an Asperger's syndrome sufferer, and she has an incredible empathy with animals, and she's done a lot to help to take away unnecessary animal suffering. I think everybody here would agree we need more of that, and so on. But effectively, I just want to say the point is we can't, on the planet we're in, with the kind of range of animals we have, take away that animal suffering, other than the deliberate kind of suffering that human beings can do for various kind of cruel ways of battery hens, all the ones you know about. Okay, so that's the natural suffering that can be caused to us, because I think we have to accept that's the way the universe is built. Similarly, animals within a food chain, that's the way it's built. And then thirdly then, what about human physical suffering where is there therefore no God? Well, take the most obvious one, which is death. Again, I think we'd have to say that is part of the human package. It's part of the way we're built. I don't know enough about medicine, but the little I've understood about cancer would be that it's a statistical necessity if you've got cells that multiply under various plans for different organs and so on, that now and then that will get out of control. And now and then will be one of the ways we understand cancer. I'm not trying to argue for it. I'm simply saying there are inbuilt limitations, if you want, embodied human beings, that effectively the death is the obvious one. So what about that then? If there's a good God, is he incompatible with that? Should we have been found a way that we'd never die, that we'd never know illness? I can only give an example. A very good friend of mine called Eddie Caffrey died at 31 some years ago. He happened to have the most severe form of muscular dystrophy. He was told he died at 17. He actually lived not quite twice as long. But I remember his response to people, because he'd come to the point that he'd accepted what was wrong with him. He had a wider context. And I remember him saying to me something I've never forgotten about a student I'd got to call on him who was very depressed. And I felt meeting Eddie would help him not to be so depressed. He'd meet someone in ways worse off than himself. I said, it's a pity that Pat doesn't understand that you don't solve problems, you love them. Now that might seem a hard thing to swallow. He could say it, I wouldn't say it to him. In other words, he'd come to the point that he'd accepted and therefore gone beyond. I remember him saying that, look, if you're trying to love, even someone like him who couldn't even move his hands properly, that effectively maybe you're more healthy as a person than an Olympic athlete might be. In other words, he had come to the new value, the deepest value of what a human being is. I just remember a thing he used to say to his mother when she was putting him to bed. She had needed a kind of a hoist to get him in because a big guy with a beard and so on and so forth. And he used to tell her before she left the room, Ma'am, I'm still in an uncomfortable position, because whatever position she left him in, he'd have to stay there all night. So he said, I used to say that I want that on my tombstone. Here lies Eddie Caffrey. I'm still in an uncomfortable position. But anyway, let's come to the real issue for me, which I can't pretend I'm going to resolve. I can't pretend I have a profound, absolutely knockdown answer. I don't have. But nonetheless, human suffering due to evil choices, which could be either our own moral suffering because of wrong that we do ourselves, maybe our cooperation with others who are doing wrong, and there's obviously the suffering that can happen to us when we haven't done wrong innocently, and we're obviously at the receiving end from evil doing other people. And this is, to me, yes, this is the core of the issue, which I think any person would say, yeah, that's a problem. That's an issue. But let's try to focus the problem a bit. I'd like to recall a comment many of you may have come across from Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his Gulag Archipelago. And he's written this book about the Soviet concentration camp system. But he warns against the readers simply blaming Stalin or the party or the KGB. This is what he says. If only it were so simple. 4 minutes. I thought I've left. Okay. If only, so bad I said. If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And Hannah Arendt, who's written her own book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, makes this strong statement. She warns against indulging in what she calls sweeping statements about the evil nature of the human race, about innate human aggressiveness and so on, about the German national character in particular. And this is the point, she says. One thing we can be sure of, that everyone could decide for himself to be either good or evil in Auschwitz. And this decision depended in no way on being a Jew or a Pole or a German. She's speaking as a secular Jewish person, nor did it even depend on being a member of the SS. The question then is, well, why did God create me? I remember years ago having a discussion with a couple in Brussels. I lived in Belgium for a few years, and they weren't going to have a child because of the danger of nuclear wipeout. And that focused my mind a bit on the gamble that God takes. Because one of the points about freedom is freedom can be not to choose what is good. It can be freedom to hate as well as freedom to love. That is the gamble that we can say God had the same problem as that couple. Will I make beings that are free? Freedom has to mean, and this is the point of Solzhenitsyn, I have in my heart the capability of any Holocaust. I have in my heart the capability of evil. It's not a question of just being out there. God made such a being because it seems to me many people actually get it right. I just finished with an example of one who did. Because this is not a theoretical question primarily, it's a life question. And how we live is where we answer that. So I'll give the example of Etty Hillesum. You may have heard of her. She's a Jewish woman from Holland. She started very secular, then she developed her faith when she was in the camp. She died at 29 years old in Auschwitz. She was murdered there in November 1943. I'm just going to finish with a couple of remarks that she makes when she's in the camp from her wonderful letters and diaries. I have so much love in me, for Germans and Dutchmen, Jews and non-Jews, for the whole of mankind. There's more than enough to go round. I see more and more that love for all our neighbours, for everyone made in God's image, must take pride of place over love of one's nearest and dearest. Though she stayed in the camp, she could have escaped because her parents were there, among other things, and she felt she would share their faith. And I just finished with the last comment that she makes, where she gives her source of, she's made an effort-filled development. She's someone who lived a promiscuous life in the 30s. I'm not looking down my nose at her. I'm simply saying this was a very quick change over a few years in that time in Westerbork. And this is one of the comments I like a lot because it explains how she discovered her freedom in relationship to what I could say is a transfinite personal ground of existence. My life, she says, has become an uninterrupted dialogue with you, O God, one great dialogue. Sometimes when I stand in some corner of the camp, Westerbork, my feet planted on your earth, my eyes raised towards your heaven, tears sometimes run down my face, tears of deep emotion and gratitude. My life is one great dialogue with you. Sometimes I try my hand at turning out small profundities and uncertain short stories, but I always end up with just one single word, God. And that says everything, and there's no need for anything more. So for me, concretely, not theoretically, somehow Etty has transcended the ultimate evil in her free choice to love God and those created in his image. Thank you very much.
Now my pleasure to welcome to the podium Professor Peter Singer. He's the Erud W. de Camp Professor of Bioethics at the University Centre for Human Values at Princeton University and the Laureate Professor, University of Melbourne Centre for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics. Would you welcome Peter?
Thank you very much. I want to thank Bishop Barbara Darling and Dean Ray Cleary and all of those involved in this event. As a boy who's grown up in Melbourne and walked past this building many, many times in my life. It's a pleasure for the first time to be speaking publicly in this beautiful building, which is indeed an icon, as Dean Cleary said, of Melbourne. I was a bit surprised that the other icon over there was omitted from the series. If Young and Jackson's gets a mention, what about the MCG? But let's come to the topic that we're talking about faith and reason in belief and unbelief. And I want to focus a little more on the idea of faith than Brendan did, although I will certainly come to the specific things that he discussed about the problem of evil. I want to object to the idea of faith in the sense of believing in something either contrary to the evidence or without evidence. And I think that there's a general principle here that if we think about in contexts other than religious belief, we would be inclined to agree with. There's an article that was written in the late 19th century by William Clifford called The Ethics of Belief, which puts this rather nicely. He imagines a ship owner who is the owner of a ship which is to take immigrants somewhere to the New World. We can imagine, if you like, that it's taking immigrants from England to Australia, as was very common in the settlement of Australia. And the ship, which is about to make this voyage full of immigrants, is rather old, and the question is put to the owner as to whether perhaps it needs to be checked before the voyage to make sure that it is indeed seaworthy to make such a long voyage. But the owner says, no, I don't think we need to check it because I have faith that God would not allow these good people with their families, with their innocent babes in their arms, to set out on this voyage to their new homeland and to drown in the midst of it. I have faith that my ship will make the voyage. And we can imagine, of course, that indeed the ship was not seaworthy, that it does sink, that all of those people drown, as we know that, unfortunately, many ships did drown on their way to Australia. If you've travelled down to the coast around the 12 Apostles, Loch Ard and so on, you will have seen many of the signs of the shipwrecks. So we would think that that was totally reprehensible of the ship owner to fail to carry out the precaution of a thorough check of the seaworthiness of the ship because he believed that God would not allow the people to drown. And Clifford makes the point that even if in fact the ship did make it, did come safely to port, nevertheless he was not justified in what he did because he's not justified in believing something on the basis of faith. And in fact, I think you could say that that kind of faith is something which is contrary to the evidence, because we know that many people have drowned in shipwrecks who were not evil. Again, think of the small children. If you think that everybody has sinned, all of the adults, at least the small children didn't. So it's that idea that there is something wrong with that attitude to believing in something that I think we can easily see in many contexts like that. And indeed we see it every day, if you like, in small decisions we make. When you make a decision as to whether if you're driving, you're going to pull out your car out of this street into a busier street, you don't take it on faith that there'll be no cars coming as you pull out. You look carefully and you check. We do that all the time. So I think that that principle ought to be a general one, that we should not believe in propositions about the world which are going to make a difference to the world, except on the basis of evidence, and therefore on the basis of reasoning. Reasoning being, at least in this context, looking at the evidence and forming your beliefs on the basis of the best assessment of the evidence that you can. Of course, there are other kinds of reasoning as well. There are deductive reasoning, which Brendan referred to, and we can talk about that as well. But in terms of beliefs about the way the world is, most of that is inductive reasoning or reasoning based on evidence. But faith, when it's is regarded as normal within a religious context, I think because of the lack of evidence for the beliefs that are being put forward. If you look at the Christian traditions, in the Middle Ages, you got a lot of attempts to produce rational arguments for the existence of God. The medieval scholastics believed in things like the first cause argument, the argument that the universe has to have a first cause, and that has to be God. The ontological argument, the idea that God is perfect, and if God was lacking in existence, then he wouldn't be perfect. And the argument from design, the idea that the universe appears to us as designed. All of those arguments, I believe, are fallacious, and indeed doubts about them existed already in medieval times and increased. In more recent times, as doubts about the validity of those arguments for showing belief in the existence of God declined, we instead got a rise, particularly in the Protestant tradition, of the idea of having faith instead, which I would say is simply saying, well, if the arguments don't work, we just have to say we believe anyway. And that wouldn't matter if people say, look, I like to think there's a God, it makes me happier if I think there's a God, so why shouldn't I believe there's a God? If that was simply a personal belief, an attitude to the world, if you like, you could say a way of looking at the world, okay, maybe it's not a problem. But if it becomes a belief about this is the way the world is, there is such a God, it's the Christian God, the God gave us certain commandments or rules, those rules make a difference to how we ought to live, and therefore to other people who share our faith as to how they ought to live, then I think there is something very seriously wrong going on, akin to the wrong that the ship owner was committing. And we see this indeed with the practice of faith. Just to give one example, the refusal of the Roman Catholic Church to tolerate the use of condoms has been responsible for millions of unnecessary deaths during the AIDS epidemic. The fact that even in sub-Saharan Africa, the Church was not saying to its followers, you should use condoms for the purpose of protection from a lethal disease, and so you don't infect others with that disease, has undoubtedly been responsible for millions of deaths. And that, I think, is a terrible, terrible wrong that has been done that ultimately can be traced back to religious faith. Let me come now to what Brendan was saying about the existence of evil in the world, which I see as the other side of the coin. What I've been saying so far is I don't think there is reasons to believe in God. Those arguments don't work. In particular, obviously, the argument from design may have seemed a powerful argument before we had a theory of evolution explaining the way the world is, but it doesn't really work now. And so we don't have arguments for the existence of God. I think there is a powerful argument against the existence of God, at least against the traditional Christian idea of God as all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. And in response to what Brendan said, I guess the issue really here is what we mean by saying that God is all-powerful. Because his explanation of a lot of the suffering in the world was that, well, this is just in accordance with the laws of nature. In particular, that was his account of the suffering that results from natural disasters. And as I said in the article from which he quoted, and which he did accurately represent. I think that this is the suffering that we should focus on, because the suffering caused by humans, the suffering of Auschwitz or of Stalin's Gulag, can perhaps be explained in terms of saying God gave us free will. That's the traditional answer to it, and therefore he has to let these things happen. You could raise questions about that. You could say, was it really worth giving us free will? Look at what we've done with it. But let's just say that it was worth it. Let's just assume that. The really difficult case for this argument, I think, is the suffering of innocent beings through natural disasters. So through earthquakes, or perhaps let's talk about droughts, since we live in a drought-prone country and we have only recently emerged from one of the worst droughts that we have ever known. Now, again, some Christians might say, well, some of the suffering is because people have sinned and deserve it, so that's why I focus on those who are innocent. They could be human infants, they could be non-human animals. And Brendan's answer to this seemed to be that somehow there are laws of nature. He talked about the laws of tectonics which lead to earthquakes, and perhaps he would also say in regard to droughts, well, there are laws of nature that cause the climates to fluctuate in a certain way. But what are we really saying here about God if God cannot alter these things? If God is supposed to be the creator and he cannot create a planet in which there is, let's say, stable rainfall patterns? Are we saying he can only create a planet in which droughts periodically occur and in which, therefore, many people starve to death and their babies die because their crops fail simply because it didn't rain? Or if we're talking about animal suffering, in which we've seen it here, we see it every time there's a severe drought, of course. Our native animals die because there isn't enough water or there isn't enough food for them to eat, and they die slow, miserable deaths. Are we really supposed to believe that God could not have created the world differently? That's a very limited conception of God. It's a different one, certainly from the one that I have standardly understood, and the one that is represented most commonly in the Christian religious tradition, or for that matter in the Abrahamic tradition, the Jewish in the Jewish, Christian and Islamic traditions. And so we have if you like, a reinterpretation which is intended to adjust for the fact that the world has evil in it, or has, So let me also just comment on this idea about suffering. Brendan suggested that for me, suffering is somehow an absolute evil. I don't want to say that, of course, that suffering is an absolute evil in the sense that one is never justified in inflicting suffering. As a consequentialist, I think you should judge right and wrong by the consequences, and unfortunately, sometimes we have to cause a certain amount of suffering in order to prevent more suffering or to produce a greater good. We do it to ourselves. I do it every time I make an appointment with a dentist. I know I'm causing myself some suffering, but I'm preventing more suffering, so I believe anyway. And if you're justified in doing it to yourself, then sometimes you may be justified in doing it to others as well. So suffering is not an absolute evil in that sense, but it is something that I think the world would be better off without. And most of us do believe that. Most of us do try to reduce suffering, at least of those we care about, and we admire people who reduce suffering in general. So that's why I think that the existence of unjustified suffering is evidence that Brendan quoted me as saying that either God is evil or he's a bungler. I would interpret Brendan's view of saying it as either God is evil or his powers are rather limited. and Brennan was taking the latter of those courses. So I guess we'd have to ask ourselves, what sort of a God really would this be, whose powers are limited? Finally, let me just make one more point in the couple of minutes I now have, and that is that before we decide on sticking to our own faith, in our own particular set of religious beliefs, I think we ought to take a good look at the world around us and look at other people who have other faiths. And note that in most cases, the faiths that people have are to do with the society in which they were brought up, and in particular the faith of their parents and their broader community. Of course, some people change their faiths. Some Christians become agnostics or atheists. Some of them convert to other religions. Some atheists or agnostics become religious. But overwhelmingly it's true that if you're brought up in a Christian society, you're more likely to become a Christian than, let's say, a Muslim. Whereas if you're brought up in a Muslim society, you're more likely to become a Muslim than a Christian. And if, as you sit here in this beautiful building, thinking of your Christian faith, which inspired the construction of this building, and you think that somehow, yes, that's what's really surely true, that's what's really self-evident, the story that the Gospels tell of God sending his Son to save us and so on, then think about how similarly a Muslim might have faith in the teachings of the Quran, just as well grounded from the point of view of faith, and how they may lead to completely different sets of beliefs about a number of important things. And if we think about that, then, of course, I think that means we ought to cast doubt, we ought to have some scepticism about our own beliefs and what is the basis for those beliefs. And finally, let me say that I think when we have seen some of the things that have happened in the world as a result of religious faith, that also ought to give us some pause. The events of September the 11th, 2001 are still fairly fresh in our minds. I was very close to New York City on that day, so perhaps they made more of an impression than if you saw it on television. But let's remember that those people also, the people who brought that disaster about, had very strong religious faith. We, of course, would not share that faith, at least in the belief that that makes that the right thing to do. But I think what we would want to see would be people to take a more critical attitude to the formation of beliefs that, in extreme cases, might lead to those sorts of actions, and in other cases still may lead to a view of the universe which shapes moral beliefs in ways that are often less desirable than they would be if we did not have those beliefs. Thank you very much.
So I'll obviously not hit everything, but let's come to the last stuff about being brought up as Catholics, Jews, Muslims or whatever. Certainly as a Christian, from the very, very beginning, Christians have been asking, Jewish people too, you can't read the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes or the book of Job without being struck by thinking, were the people who wrote these from New York? Because they're very testy, they're very cantankerous, they're asking questions all the time. That's part of the Jewish tradition. Jews don't work in terms of the Greek straight-line logic. They have a more serpentine way of working through it that way, which is just as convincing if you read the book of Job. So similarly, as a Catholic or as a Christian, from the very beginning, they have taken on the whole tradition of Greek philosophy. Justin Martyr is a good example, died 150 AD. Origen, Alexander, there's a huge tradition. The basic definition of theology in the Middle Ages was faith-seeking understanding. And I would say, yes, as a child I grew up and I accept what I learned from my parents, but I have a duty as an adult, as I certainly felt when I was a theology student and a philosopher doing philosophy. I have to ask again. I have to make that faith my own, or I'm simply, as Peter says, a tradition-bound person who will maybe blow over at the first wind that's there. So it was part of my duty as a person to check out all these questions questions. Now, I'll just try and hit the various ones that are there. I'm not as bothered, and I have to say that. The big issue in tradition and in my experience is the problem of evil, which I would see as the moral issue, the failure of human beings to recognize one another as human beings and their desire to destroy them. And we've had a lot of that in the last century, and it continues in this, and it's never been away. So I really won't get into that. We just have to disagree on that one that's there. But let's come back then to some of the other issues that are there about, say, accepting our faith as a kind of easy thing to go with. The fact is that Christians have died in the millions in the last century, obviously in Russia, East Europe, in China, lots of places you can name. By example would be Sophie Scholl, a 21-year-old German student in Munich who consciously was aware as a devout Lutheran that she was risking her life by making a protest against Hitler. Nothing to do with survival, nothing to do with making it easy, taking the difficult way out, which was to risk her life. Plenty other examples of that. Just then to say things about the various proofs for God's existence, the medievals didn't cook them up. Aquinas is almost directly borrowing from Aristotle. In other words, and that is a tradition, as I say, which I do not think has been taken on board by contemporary Anglophone atheists, that there is a non-religious tradition of reason. The people who invented reason, it was a discovery. The Jews didn't get there. The Christians didn't get there. It was the Greeks who discovered reason, articulated it, and said what it was about, the quality or the organ that asks the ultimate questions about existence. And so they took those up and put those questions to themselves. Just to take the question of the argument for design, it's not the one of intelligent design. The argument for design is one that hit Fred Hoyle. He's an English scientist. I used to read his science fiction writing. He is an atheist, or was an atheist. He's the guy that discovered nucleosynthesis, the whole process by which stars give rise to the heavier elements. And so he then, when he did that, was so struck by the design, he said someone must have turned on the cooker, because it's such a precise little measurement, a little bit too much or too little, it couldn't have happened. There wouldn't be rocky planets, there wouldn't be life, there wouldn't be carbon as we know it. So effectively he then changed. It isn't that he discovered a personal God, but the divinity he got to was probably closer to Aristotle's. But it wasn't an 18th century deism. Similarly, the one atheist we studied when we were younger, I would say far better for his intellectual rigour. If you want to read a good argument for atheists, read Anthony Fleur's earlier essays, which I read as a student. I was part of our job. Anthony Fleur, in the later years of his life, again faced with what he felt was an incredibly difficult order in the biological universe, again found something like the same divinity that Fred Hoyle did. So I don't know if it's that closed at all. Similarly, with this notion of laws coming from down there, I would say, look, if I'm reading Aquinas, who's, if you like, the intellectual that Catholics tend to take seriously, and many Anglicans like E.I. Mascal, for example, effectively, he is working on what he calls an understanding of reality. The phrase natural law goes back to Aristotle. He uses the phrase, what is right by nature, way back. But the actual awareness that human reason can discover a shape in our lives according to which we should respond to what is good or not. I think everyone shares that. He certainly feels that. Everyone has awareness there's something, Aquinas puts it very simply, that we should do what is good and we should not do what is wrong. He then fills that out with an anthropology. So and then just a last little comment, because I'm sure my 5 minutes, I'm probably already over it, but effectively the condom stuff is something that comes up all the time. For starters, the countries where the people have died most disastrously from AIDS, the huge percentage of them are countries like South Africa, Botswana and a few more. The percentage of Catholics in those countries isn't more than 4%. I think in Botswana it's 2%. The country which has a reasonable number of Catholics and a reasonable number of Anglicans that has been most successful in dealing with AIDS without condoms has been Uganda. And they've adopted a program about abstinence. I forget the exact title and so on. But the person to read, you can find him on your internet, is John Marshall. I think his first name is John Marshall. So he's the professor of epidemiology or whatever in Harvard. And he just says the condom issue is not the reality. It's nothing to do with solving the problem of AIDS in Africa. I'm not asking you to believe me. Look up Marshall, Harvard, and you'll find his answer there. Now, if I have time, they haven't stopped me here. Okay. So look, I'm just about, give me one more second. Yeah, just one more thing then, because you just got too late with stopping me there. The point about, I know we have another few minutes. I'll shut up. Sorry. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for reminding me about the fact that I didn't address the point about why is there something rather than nothing, which you mentioned right at the beginning, Brendan, and I think what you said in relation to Fred Hoyle and what's sometimes called the anthropic principle is really relating to that, to the idea that if the laws of physics were somewhat different, then we wouldn't be here at all. But that's a rather strange argument because, of course, before we can ask this question, we have to be here. We have to know that we're here. And so it's asking a question when you already have the evidence that things turned out one way. They did turn out this way, obviously. They turned out so that there are solid planets that can have beings that can exist like us. And so whatever the odds were, and there's some discussion about whether indeed Hoyle was right, that things had to be so fine-tuned or not, but whatever the odds were, it's worked out that way and we're here to talk about it. And we would never have known if it had worked out differently. Those who think that there are many parallel universes, well, maybe there are universes that have no intelligent life because the laws are different, if we can imagine that. So I don't think we really can use that as much of an argument. I do want to agree with Brendan about the importance of reason, because that I think is really what we're talking about, that reason, in my view, ought to be the guide to our lives and not faith. And I do agree with him that I'm not simply talking about instrumental reason. I think we can reason to some extent about what things are good and bad. And this is not only given that you somehow already take certain purposes, but I think that when we put ourselves in the position of others, we can see that for them to suffer pain unnecessarily is a bad thing, and we can found an ethic on that. Now, some of you may be saying, aha, he's really talking about the Golden Rule, and isn't the Golden Rule a religious teaching? Don't we get it in the Jewish and then Christian teachings? And we do. But the fact is we also get it in the great secular traditions as well. You get it in the Confucian tradition, for example, which is a non-religious ethical tradition. So basically I would say that wherever you have human beings who think hard and long about how they should live, ask those deep ethical questions, their reasoning leads them along certain lines that say, put yourself in the position of the others who are affected by your action. And, of course, the religious traditions contain elements of reasoning, undoubtedly, going back to the Greeks in the case of the medieval scholastics, certainly, as Brendan said. And so there are valuable elements in those traditions which I certainly would want to preserve, because they're elements which are common with non-religious traditions as well. My objection is rather to the use of faith where those arguments are felt to be lacking. Let me just say one thing about the point I made about condoms and AIDS. Even if the number of lives was not millions, as I believe it to be, but only thousands or even only hundreds, I think that would be a tragedy. And there are certainly many other cases of unnecessary suffering that we see existing as a result of religious faith, including, for instance, the unnecessary suffering of homosexuals for many centuries, persecuted by religious belief, including, for instance, the unnecessary suffering of women not able to have abortions because of the religious beliefs that led them to be unable to determine whether they're going to be pregnant or not. I take it that's my time, so I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you to both of them. Obviously, you've been very busy texting, SMS texts. I hope you're ready to stay till about 1 o'clock in the morning with the number of questions. So we have been selective in the sense of making sure that the areas are being covered. And I will invite 1 or 2 speakers to come to the microphone so that people who haven't been able to text, who may like to ask a question, may do that. But the first question I've got is to both Peter and to Brendan. And the question is, are there objective moral truths, and what does that reveal about God? Peter?
Do I need to come to the
I think it'd be a good idea. Yeah.
Thank you. That question really picks up what I was saying at the end. My answer is yes, there are objective moral truths, and it doesn't tell us anything at all about God. It tells us something about the nature of the world, that, for example, for there to be suffering which does not lead to an overall reduction of suffering or does not lead to greater happiness, that there is something wrong with that. So, for example, would have been my third example if I'd had my 5 minutes hadn't run out, but I'll give it now as I've got the floor again. So, for example, the suffering of somebody who has a terminal painful illness and does not see any point in lingering for another week or another month before they die, and seeks, therefore, assistance in dying from a physician, but is not allowed to have it because they live in Australia and the religious bodies are strongly against the legalisation of voluntary euthanasia. That seems to me to be an evil. It's just completely pointless suffering that is occurring. So I think that is objectively wrong, but I don't get that in any way from any belief in the existence of God.
Brendan?
Okay, yes, I think, again, we're very happy to agree with Peter that there are objective moral truths, but I do think that God does come into them in the sense of that God provides an enormous context which can make suffering, an enormous suffering, much more bearable. But just to come to the very last point, in Ireland we've got palliative care centres, I think also in Australia. Nobody has to die in pain. No one has to die in dehumanised ways when they're in a controlled environment. So I really don't think that's an issue. But if I do think, and I know that Peter isn't happy with notions of sanctity of life, image of God, so I'll not use them, although I've just annoyed him by even saying them. But effectively, if I think that I am going to live in a union with God forever, I think that gives me pause about a whole lot of moral activities that I might otherwise involve in. It might slow my hand. It might make me feel that effectively it's not just me that's deciding what's going on in the world, that I'm under a judgment. That's not an external judgment. I'm under judgment of myself by my own actions, in the light of an eternal value which I want to be with. So I think every activity I take as a human being, if I bring God into the picture, I think it enormously contexts it, makes suffering and even evil, if I'm opposing it, much more. I have more courage to oppose it. And also other issues, I'm much more careful about how I would deal with some of the issues that Peter has just mentioned, including the killing of innocent unborn life.
Another question to Peter Singer this time. If we would be better off without suffering, can the world actually exist without suffering?
Thank you. I don't think that a world can exist without suffering as long as it has sentient beings in it. But that's not to say that we can't greatly reduce the amount of suffering in the world. In fact, I think the progress of civilization has enormously reduced the amount of suffering in the world. If you want evidence of that, look at Steven Pinker's recent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which argues that violence has dramatically declined over the course of civilization going back hundreds and even thousands of years. So I think we can have a progressive view that we can reduce the amount of suffering, but it's hard to imagine that, given the way sentient beings are, we'll ever get to a stage where there is no suffering at all.
I'll invite one or two people to come to the microphone if they'd like in a few moments. You can come now, and you just line up. One down there, yes, and I think two. Yes, just those two, please. I may come back to more later on. Next question is to Brendan. I'm confused. Why do you feel the need to attribute purpose to the universe and existence? Why can't things just be?
Well, take, for example, a new discovery in biology, which, again, Richard Dawkins never mentions, called evo-devo, evolutionary developmental. In other words, what they found out since the 90s is that all animal body plans from when organic animals begin, various organs begin, which is around 540 million years ago, they have the same body plan, leaving out jellyfish. So that's an enormous difference. A person like Simon Conway-Morris, who's an evolutionary biologist in Cambridge, he's very strong. He has no problem accepting creation and order. He's saying actually evolution itself has much more shape than we used to think it had. Particularly because evo-devo shows that that's the element of animals that never... I'm delighted with Darwin, don't get me wrong. He's dealing with the external changes over a long time. Evo-devo deals with the developmental body plan that never changes at all. It's a basic genetic plan saying this is the top, this is the bottom, this is the front, this is the back. All eyes, including the one that doesn't fit in. There's 35 animal phyla. The phylum that isn't there, which are jellyfish, the ones that have eyes, like your enormously dangerous box jellyfish, 28 eyes they can have in their bell, as it's called, they've got the same eye plan. So effectively there's an enormous amount of shape there. That doesn't prove God's existence. We still do biology. But nonetheless, we're finding, or take astronomy, where not only are we only discovered galaxies with 1911 Hubble, but now we've got super galaxies, clusters of them, great walls. So we're discovering that the apparently random nature of the universe, 46 billion light years across at the moment that we know of, has much more shape or structure in it than anyone ever thought about. I would say that would give rise to thought that the universe has a shape. Again, does it immediately prove God's existence? Certainly not. But it would make you think about an order in the universe.
First question. Please make it short. Name and you're short, please.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much for organizing that. My name is Leon. I want to ask, this professor speaking reason come from Greece 2,500 years. This reason have more than that come from 8,000 years. Zardosh talk about that and go to Babylon. After go to Phoenicia by Persian, by Arabic we call it Phoenicia, by English by Phoenicia. These are more than that. I want to ask one question from Professor Peter Singer. If you possible, please explain for us how can everything come from nothing and nothing come from everything? Especially these are quantum physics question. If you possible, please. And then
okay, I think we've got the two questions. First of all, to Brendan, in relation to the issue of reason, older than 500 to 600 years, and the question to Peter about the creation of something out of nothing. So, Brendan, would you like to go first? Thank you for your question.
If I can quote you an Amon hymn written 1500 BC in Egypt, where the guy is trying to work out where Amon came from, the god Amon, A-M-O-N, not the Irish name. And he's saying, he had no father, he had no mother, building his own egg. So he's trying to deal with what Aristotle would say an uncaused cause. He's still within the culture, what we would call, without any derogation, negative comment about the world of the myth. He hasn't clarified the kind of issue like causation yet, but he's trying. So there's no question whatsoever that every human being, if you go back to, let's say the cave paintings we know, Lascaux 17,000 BC, more or less, or whatever, 19,000 years ago, Chauvet goes back to 35,000 years ago. The stuff is fantastic in there. They didn't live in these caves. They didn't eat in the caves. So everyone, including Soviet, when there still was the word Soviet around archaeologists, accept that they were like cathedrals. So the very earliest humans were asking questions. It didn't start with the Phoenicians. It started with the first human beings. At the moment, they start in South Africa, maybe in Pinnacle Peak in 160,000 years ago. How do we know they're human? They don't leave bones. We haven't the bones, but we have the symbols. They're already trying to order their lives, asking questions. Reason began with the first human being. But philosophy is the discipline in terms of which they articulate it. I made it very clear. Christians didn't invent it. Jews didn't invent it. It's a Greek invention. The specific ability to focus on the structure of reason, the structure of a human nature, the structure of the cosmos, economics, politics, metaphysics. These are Greek discoveries.
And Peter?
Thank you for the question. I don't believe that something can come out of nothing. I believe that there has always been something. And presumably theists also believe there has always been something, except for them the something is God. But for me, it's the universe. And let me make one little point about this, because some of you may be saying, but isn't it true that the universe began 13 billion years ago with a Big Bang? Doesn't science tell us that? And the answer is no, science doesn't tell us that at all. Science tells us that the visible universe, the known universe, appears to have begun about 13 billion years ago with a Big Bang. But any scientist will tell you that this doesn't mean that there was nothing before that. It just means that we can't know what was before that. And it's quite possible, for instance, that there has been this oscillation of universes expanding and then collapsing on themselves and expanding and collapsing on themselves. So there has always been something.
Another question to Brendan. Is it reasonable to accept bad things such as natural disasters, but good things to be the work of God? Seems to be cherry-picking to me.
Did I say that good things were immediately attributed to God? I didn't. So the fact is that humans are left on their own to work out their own destinies. God isn't running around wrapping up, sorting, putting on our nappies or tidying us up late at night or whatever. God leaves us to ourselves. So sometimes good things come from good people. Some of those good people can be atheists. There's not a question about that. So human beings are responsible. Remember Shakespeare, the fault is not in the stars, it's in ourselves. But that's a very traditional Christian statement. We are not governed by the spheres. We are responsible for the good and for the evil that happens in this world. That goes right back, if I can even touch another topic, which is in Adam and Eve, the whole story that's there, without going into the literality of that. The reality of the truth of that is that every human being from those two, as understood in the Jewish reflection, which is a metaphorical reflection, is responsible for what they do. So I'm not blaming God for the good, thanking him for the good stuff. But I have to give you a little proverb I got from someone from Zambia a few days ago, where I said, give us a local, because the African proverbs are full of wisdom. So I'm not saying I yet understand it, but he says, we shouldn't be blaming gods for leopards. We should be thanking God that they don't have wings.
Question from the floor, yes?
Thank you. My name is Gerard, and I am a Buddhist Christian, or Buddhist Catholic more precisely. A significant part of today's discussion revolves around the problem of theodicy, about the existence of God, and how do you reconcile that with the amount of suffering. My own sense is that
Can we have a question, please?
Yes, the best answer to that lies somewhere in Origen's understanding of universal salvation, combined with the Buddhist view of reincarnation and karma. And I'm just wondering whether Brendan would be able to comment on that. And the other question I have for Peter Singer is that I think your dismissal of the argument of design tends to be a little bit too arbitrary. Significant numbers of the scientific community over the last 50 years, you read Patrick Glynn's book, God, the Evidence, and that speaks a lot about that, seems to gravitate back towards belief in the spiritual. So I'm just wondering, how do you come to a conclusion that being scientific means being non-spiritual? Thank you.
Thank you. What I said was that I believe the evidence seemed to favour the argument from design until we had understood evolution, until we understood why it is that different beings seem so well suited to their particular niche that you might imagine that they were designed. I think evolution has explained that, and I'm not aware of any substantial body of scientific opinion that is returning to the idea that evolution is inadequate to explain that, and that we need to bring back some idea of intelligent design. I'm aware that there are a small number of people who defend that view. Of course, it's been a huge issue in the United States in terms of trying to get intelligent design taught in schools, but overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, the scientific bodies in the field, the professional bodies, reject that view.
Brendan?
Well, just to pick up on the karma, for many years I've taught, and right up to recently, the Bhagavad Gita, which is not a Buddhist but a Hindu text, which pays a lot of time, and it's a beautiful, to my mind, maybe one of the most beautiful Oriental religious texts I know about. I don't know them all. The Dhammapada is a Buddhist one, but the whole notion there of karma yoga, which is that you're belonging to a certain status, a certain class, and you must act that out. But there's a deeper meaning in the Bhagavad Gita, and I don't know if it's a Buddhist one, which is that everything that you do, you should really do it in in tune with, in this case, with Krishna, with the God's design. So as a Christian, I can pull out of that, because we would believe in something like providence rather than an impersonal one. And so, although there's more than touches of it in the Bhagavad Gita, so I would certainly believe that, yes, there is a world in which I am personally relating to the divine that goes back to the Old Testament right through to the Christian stuff. And so that God is looking after me at every moment. He allows me my complete freedom, and yet in some way He's around all the time. He doesn't take that freedom away, and yet He's looking after me. So it's not very easy for me to accept that I have to do something. I don't think genuine Buddhism means that you're determined to do something. If something happens, you are caught up in that. The early Christians, take Augustine, really disagreed with the whole world, which even Aristotle accepted, that the spheres affect what we do. He said, no, because that would take away our freedom. So it's always a difficult balance, and I don't know if I can fully protect it if I accept that I'm determined neither from my biology nor from, if you like, the spheres or some other thing like that. But nonetheless, I would have the greatest respect for the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition, but I think we would be very, very strong on the fact that the most important form of how we try to live is that we're prepared to love our neighbours, and that I can break out of any bad habit, any bad situation I'm in. When I turn around, I have the capacity to convert and to change. I often see this happening in good people who've been maybe addicted in various ways. Not often, but I see it happening. People turn around. I don't know whether karma allows that, but certainly I've seen it happen.
To Peter, this question. Is Peter objecting to those who have faith in faith, or that people have faith in God, and doesn't he have faith in the theory of evolution?
Thank you. I'm not sure that I understand the business about faith in faith. I guess I'm objecting to people who form beliefs about reality on the basis of faith rather than on the basis of evidence in front of them. And that perhaps also leads into my response to the claim that I have faith in the theory of evolution. No, I don't have faith in the theory of evolution. I think that there is a huge amount of evidence now for the theory of evolution. That evidence began to be assembled by Charles Darwin in the 19th century, and he developed an impressive body of evidence. But we have much, much more than that now, and it really has been confirmed by things that Darwin had no idea about, like, for example, DNA. He could never have guessed that we could measure the relatedness of different species and when they diverged by looking at their DNA. But that evidence confirms what he had said. If we discovered DNA and then we'd done these things and we'd said, oh, well, it seems like there's no connection between the anatomical and physiological resemblances and the DNA. So, for example, yes, we seem to be rather more like chimpanzees than we are like jellyfish, but in fact, when you look at the DNA, we're much closer to jellyfish than we are to chimpanzees. That would have been a huge problem for the theory of evolution. But it worked out exactly in reverse, so that became confirming evidence for a theory that already had a lot of evidence for it.
Next to the microphone.
My name's Jamie Pearce. Can we assume for the moment that I was brought up without any religious faith and that I have no faith in anything that I experience other than what I have seen as I've grown up? Is it reasonable of me to then start wondering about the question of the meaning of my life? And is it appropriate and helpful for me to use reason to start to explore what the meaning of my life might be? Or is this an unreasonable question? And is it reasonable then to say perhaps I can wander beyond pure reason and ask questions that might be about the numinous and mystery that might then take me somewhere beyond reason?
Thank you. Peter?
Yes. Thanks, Jamie. It's a very good question, and certainly I think given the kinds of beings we are, with the capacity to think about our place in the universe and what we ought to do with our lives, certainly it's highly reasonable of us to use our reason to try to think about the choices that are open to us. Small choices about what we do today, or about whether we help somebody who needs assistance, and big choices about our career if we're at a stage of our life when we're forming that. And politics and so on. Yes, we should use reason about all of those things. Now, are we going to get to a point, you're asking, in that reasoning where we might say reasoning can't take me any further and therefore there's some sort of mystery here? I'm not going to rule that out, but I would say that we need, before we say I can't go any further with reasoning and somehow where I've got is not satisfactory, we need to say, well, is that really so? Why can't we accept the various things that we see and make choices on that basis? And that's in fact what I've tried to work out in the various books that I've written about ethics. I've tried to suggest how, without thinking that there is some mystery that is impenetrable to our reasoning capacities, we can make reasonable choices about ethics and about how we ought to live. I've got a book, in fact, with just that title, How Are We to Live, which discusses that kind of choice and also discusses the role of meaning in our lives, which for me is going to be the meaning that we attribute to our lives rather than the idea that all of human existence has some meaning because it was created by some divine being with some particular purpose or intention.
Thank you.
Brendan, can I follow it on with a question that's in the same vein, I think? And the question is, we often need to use emotion as well as reason to gain knowledge. Should emotion not be given equal weighting in the role in faith and unbelief?
Well, the German philosopher Hegel, that you might have thought of, he says there's three ways in which we deal with the big issues. Philosophy is one, religion is another, and art is another. And let's just speak about art. One of the courses I try to do is the search for the transcendent in modern art, and it can also be done in modern music. And very often, there was a wonderful exhibition in Melbourne here about 10 years ago called Beyond Belief, and you had wonderful paintings there by many artists who were not necessarily regarded as believers. Take someone like Georgia O'Keeffe. She's got a painting called Ladder in the Sky, and she's obviously expressing in her 70s this she's not conventionally a believer at all, and yet in her art you can see what's, this reaching out beyond that the last speaker mentioned. So effectively there is, it seems to me, or let's say Shostakovich is definitely regarded as an atheist, and yet he does write wonderful music about the Psalms. And so why is he doing this in his later years still in the Soviet Union? Because they're saying something to him. So I never discount these different searches that are going on, and it's obvious that feeling, image have an enormous amount to do with it and so on. But I would still say, and if I could come back to things that Peter said at various stages, that when he speaks about evidence, it always reminds me of an exchange I had with Richard Dawkins one time. We were reviewing together his book called The Devil's Chaplain. And in the chaplain, that book, there's a chapter called A Letter to My Daughter. And he was urging his daughter at that age, 12, he was separated from his wife at that stage and that daughter, and so on, that she didn't basically go along to religion classes because there was no evidence. And he said he didn't send it to her, in fact, but it was published later. Okay. So I remember asking him then, but would you accept that what I got when I read that letter was, it wasn't that I agreed with the content, was that it was expressing the love of a father for his daughter, maybe all the more poignant because he was separated in a way from her. And he agreed. And I said, would you accept that that really important thing in your life couldn't be proved in any... My doctor happens to be in psychology. I'm only too aware of the limits that psychology has. But it's not easy to imagine a genuine experiment that would touch on the quality of freedom required to catch love. So would you agree? And he himself said, yes, I would. You can't prove that in the same way. In other words, he accepted a point Aristotle makes, that it's the mark in his ethics, it's the mark of an educated man to look for the kind of proof the subject matter allows. Aristotle is the first one who gave logic a clear formulation. He knew what a logical proof was. I'm not saying he knew what a modern empirical proof was. So the point was that Dawkins more than accepted it in that case. And I would say, it goes for a whole range of other things. In other words, if I take, and earlier on we were speaking, before we came here, about the logical positivists in Vienna, the Vienna School and so on, but they make it as a rule that the only evidence acceptable, and it's in Dawkins' new book called The Magic of Reality, the only evidence that counts is the evidence that comes through our five senses. The problem with that is that statement itself is an ideological dogma, if I can use the big words. In other words, there is no proof in science, by the methods of any natural science, that you can say that the only evidence that we can accept is that of the five senses. You can't prove that. That's a statement that needs a theory of knowledge, and Dawkins is not interested. So I would say, effectively, the question about evidence for faith is a complicated one, but it certainly doesn't exclude reason, and it's all the better if feeling, image, and that are backing it up.
Now, I know there are about half a dozen people, but I'm sorry, only one person. The next person we will have time to ask a question, so please ask the others to sit down. And I still have about 27 questions here, of which I'm trying to put a couple together. So the lady at the microphone, quickly.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm from Singapore's Humanist Society. If natural disasters are part of astrophysical laws, just the way gravity is, why should we pray? Why should we seek for divine intervention when it's part of God's plan?
I assume that's to Brendan.
Yeah, well, certainly I pray for all sorts of things. I said a few prayers before I came in here tonight and so on. So the point is that going to change things? I think the big point of prayers, we've got a place called Lourdes in France where there were, we believe, miracles. Some of them very rigorously checked out. I'm not getting into the debate. Did they happen or not? I certainly think they did. Medical non-believers have said that. Okay, but nonetheless, when you go to Lourdes, you meet many people there who go to pray. But what they pray for is the grace to get the context within which they can understand and live their illnesses. Very, very few, let's say 1 in a million may get a cure. There's very few cures accepted. So effectively I would say, what do I pray for? Primarily I pray that I may be able to understand what God's will is for me. I'll finish with a little comment from the same guy, Eddie, I mentioned. I remember some charismatics came to pray over him. And he said, he let them. He just put up with it. I remember he said, because people who are depressed used to come to him, and he says, some priest used to be, he thinks I'm a bleeding shrine. But the point was, anyway, Eddie's point was, I don't want a cure. I want to do what God wants for me. If it's to be cured. If not, not. So in other words, I think that's what prayer is for. It's not to manipulate the world. It's to get my spirit in an attitude of openness to what God wants best.
Okay, this is the final couple of questions, and I'm going to try and put them together because I think they somehow fit together. And the first question is not the Christian religion itself an answer to the problem of evil, the promise of salvation and the heaven where there would be no evil? How can we have objective moral truth without a God to underpin this? The first one was to Brendan and the second one was to Peter, but I think they could both have a go at answering. So, Peter, do you want to try first?
Yes, okay. So is the Christian religion an answer to the problem of evil because there's salvation afterwards? Well, no, because for two reasons. One is the problem of animal suffering. My understanding is the Christian religion does not promise salvation to non-human animals, but they still suffer. So there is still an evil occurring in the world which an all-good God would have prevented. But secondly, on my understanding, the suffering of, let's say, a baby who then dies, even if that baby is going to be saved, the suffering is still a bad thing. In other words, if you imagine two babies, both of which live, let's say, for a year, one of them lives a happy life and then dies and is saved, the other suffers excruciatingly from some debilitating disease for a year and then dies and is saved. Brennan might say, well, in the light of all eternity, that year is nothing, but it's not nothing. It might be very small, but it's not nothing, and I think the world would have been better without it. The other part of the question, or other question, I think, was objective beliefs in ethics underpinned by God. Look, I think that God does not underpin beliefs. There's this ancient thing going back to the Greeks, who Brendan is fond of in Plato, the Euthyphro, that if you really think that somehow God makes something good, then that suggests that God's commands are just arbitrary, that God could just as easily have made torture good and made helping your neighbour bad. And then if that were God's wishes, then torture would have been good and helping your neighbour would have been bad. We don't really think that. I think that's not a defensible position. So we have to say that the idea that torture is bad and helping your neighbour is good has to in some way be independent of God commanding or wishing it to be so. Therefore, we need, on any view, theistic or non-theistic, to have an idea of goodness which exists independently of God.
I'll just come back to the euthyphro as well, because I completely agree with Peter on that one. You've got, in the euthyphro, is an idiot. Unfortunately, he's a priest, a Greek priest, and he's the moron of that thing. He understands absolutely nothing. The argument goes around in circles. But the big point for him is something good because God makes it so, or is it good because it's good in itself? And Plato definitely would agree with Peter, and I think with me, thing is good in itself. We can then look about some other reason behind it. But let's just come back to the first part of the question: does Christianity make things better? I had a family of mine that were working in Papua New Guinea years ago. Their child, Edel, was born with spina bifida. The doctors there wanted to have the child killed. They said it's too much, too painful. They insisted that the child would be, so eventually, with much grudgingness, the doctors allowed the girl to be operated on in Brisbane, and she lived for 12 years. She needed a brace, she managed, she was fine. There's no way, if you knew Edel, even if she wanted to die, she was a very happy person. I think modern medicine, and we can both agree on this, has done an awful lot in the direction of pain relief. I think it's fantastic. But so in other words, but Christianity gives you a context. I think that's the big point. And so if I was just one little point about animals. We believe in a new heaven and a new earth. It's in Isaiah, it's in St. Peter, it's in the book of Revelation. I cannot imagine, as a total animal lover myself, a world that makes sense to me without lions, tigers, cats, snakes, the whole darn lot, even these horrible red-back spiders you've got. We need all of them back again. Maybe not with the same amount of venom. But let me just finish with, to my little point, the big difference. I haven't been speaking about Christianity because I'm thinking I want to work on reason. I want to talk with Peter. I don't want him to have to bother with what I believe in. I think there are rational grounds. But nonetheless, I would say in the end of the day, what really is the core and the difference between how I as a philosopher would deal with the problem of evil and as a Christian is because I do believe there is an answer to the problem of evil, and God should do something about it. As a Christian, I think even as a Jew I could do it. God has done something about it. And what he has done is he's come down on this earth and he has shared that suffering with me. And so effectively, if you like, because God himself in Christ suffers, the whole notion of suffering takes a whole new meaning. Does it go away? It's not abolished. What's her name? I can't remember, this Jewish woman who wrote in France, Simone Weil. And she says, what I like about Christianity is not that it takes away suffering, but it gives a context within which suffering itself can be coped with. And I think it's not just coping, that's not the word, she's a better word, she's a better writer than I would ever be. But I think the big notion of a Jesus who dies on the cross, who says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Who himself shares Peter's experience of not having an experience of God, of the lights going out. He may not see it that way, but I would certainly see someone without God as someone who in Jesus is suffering the experience of the lack of the divine. Jesus goes through that himself. I met someone many years ago who was an atheist in East Europe. I was a very great friend of this person. When someone told her, because she was always asking why suffering, the very question Peter asked, why? And they said, the name of our God is why. If there's a God called why, she said, he's my God. I've been looking for him all my life.
Thanks both to Peter and Brendan for their contribution tonight. As I was thinking and reflecting on what they were saying, I recall that when I was a young person, my understanding of God was very simple. But then I began to use all my senses, reason, emotion, intellect, everything, to think through the process. And my God today is very different to what it was when I was 7, 8 and even 20. And in fact, I have regular arguments with God about what's right and wrong in the world. And I think the God that many Christians follow is that sort of God, that we struggle with our faith and we struggle with the doubts. But at the end of the day, the question is, why are we here and what's the meaning of life? And that's for us something very significant. So thank you to Peter and to Brendan, and I'll hand over to Bishop Barbara for the final words.
It's my pleasure to add to what Canon Ray has just said. Many thanks to Peter Singer and to Brendan Purcell for their willingness to share in this conversation on the role of reason in faith and belief. It's been interesting, thought-provoking, and challenging to hear their conversation, and I hope we'll go away with many ideas that we'll be able to consider and to look at. Would you join with me now, please, as I give them a little token of our thanks in thanking them for being here with us this evening. Thank you also to those who texted their questions or asked their questions. As we come this weekend in Melbourne to the Global Atheist Convention being held here, a group of us from the Melbourne Diocese have met for several years in response to the Global Atheist Convention and the messages that come from atheists, and we've met as the Christianity and Atheist Committee, and the names are listed on the sheet that you have. As well as organising this evening's conversation, we've also prepared some book reviews and on relevant literature. And this pamphlet, which I have here, which is Christians Answering 7 Questions Posed by Atheists. You're welcome to take one of these as you leave the cathedral. We'd ask you to, when you leave, to leave by the back, as the section through here doesn't open up at night time. And so please feel free to take one of those pamphlets, or you can look it up when you're at home on the internet on our website at www.melbourne.anglican.com.au, and that's written on the back of this. We hope that these resources will help you, whatever your background, your beliefs, in looking at these issues. I'd like to thank the Acting Dean, Canon Ray Cleary, for moderating our conversation this evening, and for permitting us to use this sacred space as we look at matters of faith, belief, unbelief, and reason. I'd also like to thank Roland Ashby and the team from Anglican Media for their publicity and support in preparing for this evening. You're very welcome to come to the back of the cathedral and continue some informal conversations there. And a reminder that your gold coin or something paper would also be appreciated as you leave, if it hasn't already gone into the bucket. And also a reminder that the cathedral will remain open for a while, but we need to close by 9:30, so we've got about 25 minutes. If people want to continue on conversation here, or you might prefer to go with friends across the road to another icon, either to Young and Jackson or Federation Square, and continue chatting over something to drink and talking to each other. So thank you very much for coming, and good night.